Okay, this is my first time using Canva, so hopefully everything goes smoothly. But my book review is on the book called Teaching What Really Happened by James W. Lowen. Um, anyway, he kind of talks about how to avoid using textbooks completely and how they're kind of outdated. They're more tertiary sources. And he focuses more on talking about the methods we can do to help students engage with history and actually like the process of doing it and how to avoid common misconceptions or myths when it comes to social studies practice. So he had three main ideas that I kind of drew from it. So one was just avoiding teaching myth versus fact. So he focuses a lot on truth, which we'll kind of see later on. And I'll explain that more in detail. And then his second main idea was the actual engagement of students in doing the history, so the actual application of activities and examples of what we can do as educators to help them and some important skills they should learn. And then the third main idea was applying the skills in the context of history. So he gave examples of topics or lessons that would apply to and his own personal experiences, which I thought was really cool that he focused so much on that. So, for the first part, which is avoiding myth versus fact, he gives this analogy of trees versus twigs. And I recall correctly, trees is like the historical topics, and twigs is kind of like the disconnected historical facts. And so he talks about how teachers need to focus less on twigs and more trees. Like, you need to focus on the historical topics instead of like disjointed facts about like you know, this war on this day, this name. Instead, you're going to want to focus on what's the bigger picture here? What's the objective of learning beyond just memorizing? And I thought that was a really good kind of analogy to use um, and kind of illustrates the shift we're seeing in social studies instruction. And he talks about how this is possible to happen. And we are all familiar with this word, but historiography and how historiography builds critical thinking. And so he talks about how textbooks get that historiography wrong. Um, so like there's also other things too, like historical sites and sources. They might say something happened that didn't in that location. And then also textbooks are going to be written kind of not necessarily biased, but they have this idea of progression, right? US is this common united history. And this excludes this historiography um and the experiences and the awesome sources that we can get from other people, right? We're not all common united history. There's a lot of different histories and cultures that play into the United States history. And also along with the idea of progression, textbooks might highlight the progress that we've made, but it might not acknowledge the setbacks that we've had or the stuff that's not easy to talk about, right? That we'd rather erase from our history. But the fact is, it's there and it's very important. Um, and that's why we have to really think critically about things and, like build historical empathy, all that, so like all that good stuff. And so, um, what else he talks about is the actual doing and engaging in history. And so I thought this was interesting. I didn't really think about it. Like, I know writing is a big part of like history, but like when I was in history classes, it was always memorization. Like we had one paper, like a semester probably, which I liked it when my teacher did that. But he said that having students write at least one scholarly essay is really important because they're not just like knowing the facts or sources, they're actually learning to write and support their ideas. And I thought that was really interesting. Then he also talks about the importance of local history. So making sure students are engaged in the communities, like offering field trips, offering opportunities to write, like the representatives, do different things like that. Because when it's local history, it's more related to them and it's more personal. So they're gonna have that connection, right? Um, and there's a lot of ways that like local cities and towns and stuff are connected to a bigger picture of history, and you can totally use that to your advantage in your instruction. And then he also talks about assessing credibility. And we learned this before, but he focused on like basically this test, quote unquote, which is like I locating the speaker, audience, the era, the internal contradictions, and external contradictions, which I thought was interesting, internal and external. So you could see the biases within the document, but also having students look at other documents that may contradict it or that might analyze it deeper. And I thought that was really, really important in the actual application. Okay, and so he also talked about teaching current events, And I have this little picture that I thought was interesting. So he talks about teaching media literacy and fact versus matter of opinion, which I think is super important in today's practice of like history, because you want students to learn about current events. Like that's extremely important. And so he gave us an example of the left is Obama's inauguration and the right is Trump's. And, like you can see there's a slight difference in the people. And then, he used an example of Marjorie Taylor Greene being like, there's no way to tell who has more, there's no actual metric, but like obviously there's more. And I thought that was an interesting kind of like thing that he mentioned, is talking about media literacy and current events in a way that they can look at the historical context of things, and they can also, look at it with a lens of like, okay, we're going to analyze this. Like, we're going to use critical thinking to see why Marjorie Taylor Greene might have been a little misguided, in what she had to say. And so this one is applying the skills in the context of history. So he gave an example of talking about slavery, like the history of slavery. I thought this was really interesting. He talked about meta conversation. So he talked about showing that connection to the present time, right? So, but also talking to students about what will be covered and explored, and approaching it in a way that's like easier than, because sometimes it can be really uncomfortable. And he says, like, to know your students. If you're in a predominantly white classroom or predominantly black, you might introduce the topic a little differently. And you want to connect to the present, right? Like talking about slavery. Like, slavery has created a bunch of debates about all these different things, right? And it still has it's very deeply rooted in our history, and it's something that we've been trying to deal with for a really long time, and the repercussions of it. So just that was really interesting to me, of actually applying that, being like, okay, we're going to introduce it this way. So when you view these documents, when you actually do the history, we're going to look at it through this lens. And some things might be uncomfortable, but we're going to be respectful. We're going to be whatever. I just thought that was a really good example. And he gave a bunch. He gave one about like the $24 bill myth, I think, the Confederacy. Like, he gave a bunch, right? Because a lot of those things can be viewed very differently depending on the demographic of people. And then an example of an activity that would apply to it, one I found from the book, I kind of tweaked it a little bit, but it's having students focus on one social or ethnic group. And so students will use their documents and articles to build their understanding. So instead of just reading like maybe like a possibly like biased newspaper article, something, students have to collect their own documents and articles to build their own understanding and perception of the people, right? And so that's like critical thinking skills, that's historical empathy, that's putting themselves in that kind of perspective of those people. And so they get to create their own article and headline that fits for it, and like write a few paragraphs based on using those sources that they found or the information that they found. And that was a really good way of like positioning it that way. And I think we've seen that probably before, of like, imagine you were this person in this time or whatever. I think those exercises are really good because it kind of creates the personal aspect. And it relates to the book because he kind of talks about that, like building that scaffolding to like writing, to big writing skills, and just understanding how to use your sources to create an argument. And so he had a similar example of this. I just kind of changed it. And then the strengths, I'll just do this briefly because I have a few minutes. The strengths, I really, really liked how he used examples for a good portion of the book, because there's a lot of subjects that might be harder. And like me as a teacher, I'm like, I don't know how to go about teaching this. Like, I don't know how to get students really engaged with this. And like, I liked that he focused on that. And I also liked that he gave ways to like actively engage in history as well, like the actual doing. He focused on historiography a lot too, which I think is really important, because if students don't understand and grasp the basis of historiography and just like getting into those documents, understanding it, understanding the background, like if you don't build that scaffolding and those skills, it's going to be hard for students to do it on their own. And the goal was you want them to. Weaknesses, I don't know. I don't really like didn't see any weaknesses, honestly. I thought it was all in all pretty good. I really don't have a complaint. I feel like it was pretty enjoyable. Um, I mean, it was like a lot of repeated things that we've learned in class, but it wasn't like any less meaningful. And then the connections that it had to the class, historiography, we already talked about that, primary, secondary, current events, identifying and teaching truths, and then scaffolding. And then application in social studies. Well, it says the whole point of his book: less textbook, more hands-on learning and critical thinking. So more engaging and encouraging writing and creativity rather than just memorizing things that students will probably forget. And creating a personal connection to history. That's what we want to do, is make students connect to the sources and really actually feel like it's important to them. So, my recommendation, I really liked the book actually. I feel like it's a lot of good skills. And also, I really liked how he has been in education for a really long time. Like, he gave an example from like 1967, I think. So, like, he's seen it all. So, like, I would trust him if he's like seen how textbooks have changed and how instruction has changed. Like, you can tell that he's been through it. So, I would recommend it if you want to kind of just learn more about how to approach certain subjects and how to avoid myths and really teach students truth. I really liked how he moved away from the myths, and a lot of misconceptions that there are in history teaching. So yeah.